Well, welcome everyone. It is 3 o'clock, but we still have a number of individuals kind of funneling in. So I'm going to go ahead and give them about another minute to join us, and then we'll get the Citywide Advisory Committee meeting kicked off.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. I just want to make sure my audio is working. Thank you.
You are officially in business.
Okay, awesome.
All right. It looks like we have the majority of our committee here with us. So we'll go ahead and kick off, and then as others can join us, we'll get them all caught up. So welcome to the June 17th Citywide Advisory Committee meeting for the zoning code rewrite. We want to thank you for your participation and being able to join us today. I do want to do some quick introductions. We do have some of our usual suspects aboard today, but we actually have a couple of new people that have been helping us. So I want to make sure that everybody is familiar with them as well. So my name is Andrea Tuning, and I am with the Comprehensive Planning Division with the City of Boise. We also have Deanna Dupuis, which she is also a comprehensive planner with the city's planning department. We have Wendy Ellisted, who's project management coordinator, part of our team that way, and she's a representative of the mayor's office. We have Maria Weege. She is our community engagement director. And then we have Lindsay Moser and Lindsay Drebergen, who are also here from community engagement. They're kind of our new faces, but they're going to help us with some community engagement activities and helping facilitate us with some of our IT needs so that we can actually produce this via YouTube. So we've got those individuals with us today. And we also have our consulting team with us. So we have Dawn Elliott, Gabby Hart, and Diane Kushlan, all representatives of Clarion Associates or Kushlan and Associates. So as you know, it takes a big team to make something like this happen. So we want to thank everybody for their help today. Just to get us kicked off a little bit, we want to let you know that we went ahead and released Module 1 in April, and we took that out to the public, and we just finished our community engagement efforts for that initial Module 1. So the next couple of weeks, we're going to be really busy compiling that information so that we can get that information both to our public and to you, and you know what our community is saying. Just to remind you, we had some community conversations where we visited different geographic areas throughout the city to meet with neighbors and neighborhood associations. We also had a public survey as well. And then we also had an opportunity to offer the opportunity for anybody that was interested to meet with Deanna Dupuis or myself to kind of talk about the zoning code changes, what those mean, and really what is in Module 1. So we'll be busy compiling that and make sure that you get that very soon. We anticipate you'll probably have that by that July meeting. So just to give us a brief review of what we're charged with and what our goals are as we move forward as a committee. Just a reminder that the City of Boise's vision is really to create a city for everyone. So please keep that in mind as we open up our discussions and think about things as we ask you questions or ask for feedback. Our mission is to create a city for everyone by embracing our community and the decision-making process innovating and investing to protect our environment, and ensuring a thriving local economy that benefits all. We have some strategic priorities that are important for us to note. A safe, healthy city for everyone, a home for everyone, movement for everyone, a clean city for everyone, opportunity for everyone, and then engaging everyone. And then really looking at the goals of what the zoning code rewrite is intended to do. We are hoping to create a modern ordinance that will help us implement our comprehensive plan known as Blueprint Boise. We want to make sure that we're building on those policy directions of those strategic priorities that we just talked about. So really focusing on how we can create that city for everyone. Making sure that everyone is engaged in the process, so citizens and all of our stakeholders. Making sure that we are finding the best fit for the city of Boise that includes both traditional form-based or performance-based zoning tools that allows us to be Boise, but allows us to achieve those planning goals that we have in Blueprint Boise as well. Incentivizing great design and a diverse mix of land uses to ensure that our city thrives. Creating opportunities to streamline development review procedures and increase predictability of land use decisions. And then improving the user friendliness of the ordinance so that everybody has an opportunity to be able to use the document and find the information that they're looking for through quality structure, as well as tables, graphics, illustrations, or pictures that help describe that. We as a larger committee, we are a group of community members that are distributed throughout the city. We all have various interests. We all have various experiences in our life. And we're hoping that you are that sounding board for the ideas. And as we present questions to you, that you can provide us some direction and give us a beacon so that we can move through this process with intention. And really just to go over those basic rules of engagement. We want you to arrive prepared and ready to share your thoughts and ideas. Being open-minded and thinking about community, treating others with kindness, being active listeners, not interrupting others, being ready to learn, and then really just doing your personal best. So bring in what you have to the table. So we are excited to have everybody here today, and I look forward to a valuable meeting. So with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Don Elliott with Clarion and Associates and Gabby Hart as well as they take us through the presentation. And we'll actually talk about 3 major topics today, and we'll take a brief break as well. So Don, are you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you. And I should have clued Andrea in before this, but Gabby Hart is traveling today. So it's all me, unfortunately. It's all, unfortunately, you don't even have the relief of a second speaker, but we'll get through this and get a good discussion going. So I'm going to share a screen. Here we go. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see this screen. Okay.
It looks good.
All right, good. So I'm going to get onto here. So is this, you're seeing the 2-slide version of this, right?
Correct.
I have to switch it, but you have to first find out how to switch it. How about that? Better?
Perfect.
All right, great. So let's get going. I'll just do a little bit of review for those who are not following, but I won't spend a lot of time because you've seen these graphics many times. We've gotten through the phase 2, which is diagnostic report. We're trying to stay true to that diagnostic report. It's not cut in stone, of course. Things change along the way, but that's our roadmap for what we draft. And we've done the public input for module 1. I do want to be very clear. The door is never closed. The city has to allocate its staff time to engaging people and drawing people out about the drafts. And that is a concerted effort to gather feedback. But if you get feedback 2 months from now on module 1, it will still be accepted. The door is never closed. It's a democracy. It's a public process. And so it helps us to get that feedback earlier, but the door is never closed. So now we are working on module 2, and then there'll be a similar outreach effort on that. And then module 3, which is processes. So we're now dealing with development standards. I think all of you know this by now. That blue part at the right is very important. The city has tried not to oversell itself and say, hey, once we get done talking about it, we're done talking about it. After we get the 3 modules together, and then we put the whole thing together, there's a lot of time built in for additional discussion and refinement. Once again, as we did for module 1, we've broken this into pieces. At the last meeting, we talked about lot and building dimensions, building form standards, different ways of addressing building form. Today, it's subdivisions, sensitive lands, access and connectivity. Next time, it is the various other parking, landscaping, lighting, other development standards. I know people care. If Boise doesn't get a good discussion on parking, it'll be the first big city I've ever worked in that doesn't have a good discussion on parking. So we're going to do that in July. Why did we do it this way? And the answer is, when you talk not about intensity or use, but you're talking about how development happens, we start with the big pieces: subdivisions, sensitive lands, access and connectivity. And I'll probably repeat these points as we get into the 3 topics, but for those of you who are not, you don't wake up in the morning speaking zoning, I do want to slow down and explain the logic behind this. These are the macro pieces. When we get into July, we're talking more about micro pieces. I own a lot. I have a right to do multifamily. I have a right to do a house. I have a right to do a hotel. How do I park it? How do I landscape it? How do I light it, etc.? By that time, we're talking about a building or multiple buildings on a particular lot that has been approved and recorded as part of an overall subdivision, a framework for development. By that time, you're supposed to have the framework right. These lots are in the right places. And we're now talking about how much parking is needed for that to work or to protect the neighborhood. But the framework has to be right by that time, because we're talking lot by lot by lot by lot. June is about the framework. So the plan talks about framework, Blueprint Boise, but we've got 3 topics here today, which are the fundamental building blocks of the future of the city: subdivisions, sensitive lands, access, and connectivity. And I want to, again, for the non-zoning geeks, there's an interesting phenomenon in Boise. It's not unique to Boise. We are reviewing and rewriting a document called the zoning ordinance. But that zoning ordinance includes already today, and our proposal is that the new one will also include subdivision regulations. Technically, legally, subdivision regulations are different than zoning regulations. But most large and medium-sized cities want them in one document. You've already crossed that bridge. We're refining it and trying to make it better. But why are they different? It's because subdivisions were handed to the city by your state legislature with the left hand. They said, you have the power to regulate how lots are created, how new development lots are created, to ensure they have access to a public street, to ensure they have adequate utilities, to ensure that they are legally described so you don't get fraud in the land development process. Interestingly, subdivision powers were given to city governments long before zoning, because they have to do with, does a road go through here? I own land. How can I get to it if a road doesn't go through here? I had land. I thought I had utilities. I don't have utilities. How did that happen? And so subdivisions are, with the left hand, the legislature said, you can create systems that define for the public what's a developable lot and how they're laid out, and how do you make sure they all have access and connectivity and utilities to work well in the future. They're the building blocks. And I'll tell you a dirty little secret about zoning ordinances is that you got to get subdivision right. Subdivision, the ability to plat lots the way you want them, in the places you want them, subject to the controls that you want, is actually more important to the future of the city than the rest of zoning. Because if you get the framework wrong and you build in long car trips or non-connectivity or the ability to build and compromise sensitive lands, it's very hard to undo that in the future, because the land has been platted, it's been reported, it's been sold. And now if you try to unwind that, you're dealing with multiple property owners who have rights to expect that you will protect what they have. It's hard for a city council to unplat lots. So the rules by which they are platted are extremely important. And that's why we start with that parcel. Let's talk the framework within which all the details play themselves out over the course of the next decades. Sensitive lands and access and connectivity are actually, they relate to subdivisions and they relate to our June topics. And I'll talk more about that when they get it. But when you think about this discussion, think about, all right, we got to get the lots, the rules, how you create developable parcels right. And then what are the big things that you don't want to go wrong? One is, if you want to protect lands, floodplains, foothills, areas around airports, areas with pollution, which doesn't really affect you guys very much, but things that you want to make sure you don't expose people to or you protect because they're major assets, get that first. Write that down first. Have it relate to the way you do subdivisions. By the way, telegraphing the future, it'll also relate to the July discussion because you try to set up lots that don't mess up your sensitive lands and compromise them. And you want access and connectivity, streets, trails, bike paths, roads, anything that has to do with how transit, how things get around and connect to the lots. So this discussion starts here rather than, for some people, I think parking is a sexier topic, or I wanted to talk lighting and landscaping. Hey, we'll get there. But that all plays itself out in this situation. And basically over the last 50 years, it used to be states and cities treated subdivision as a mechanical tool. We've got zoning, you prove to us that your lot complies with zoning, we turn the crank and here's your plat and record it. That has changed dramatically. In the field of land use, people put more and more time into, let's get the framework right. Let's try to figure out how by the time we get to July's topics, we're really sure that sensitive lands have been protected, access and connectivity are what we want them to be. And that too has changed because it used to be all about cars and now it's not. So that's the logic behind what we're doing. But we will be back to talk about the details in July within the framework of today's discussion. And then by August, we intend to present the draft of Module 2, which covers all of these topics. So I did want to, I'm sorry for the long-winded, but it's helpful to set a foundation for why we're doing it this way and how important it is. These are maybe not the sexiest topics that people came prepared to talk about, but they're very, very important. So we did want to say, does anybody have comments about the topics we raised last week, which were, just in case you don't remember, we talked about all the different ways in which Boise regulates density and intensity and inform. Maximum dwelling units per acre, maximum floor area ratios, lot size, lot width, lot frontage, etc. And then we also talked about step downs, how commercial areas, you can prevent the impacts on nearby residential areas by stepping down heights or intensities or lot layout. That relates to the intensity that's allowed to be developed. If you spoke last week and you don't have anything more to say, we don't want to repeat anything. But I did want to give a small chance to say, if you left the meeting and say, I still don't understand it, or I have more to say, or I never got to say it, let's give 2, 3, 4 minutes and see if anybody has anything to add before we get into the topic today. I'm sorry if I look like I'm not paying attention, it's because I have 2 screens going and you can't look at both of them at the same time. So anything about those topics, not Module 1, but the opening discussion on Module 2 on form and intensity. All right. Once again, in the interest of valuing your time and respecting your time, I'm not going to dwell on that. Suffice it to say that the door is always open for comments. So let's talk about subdivision. We're going to do one of these topics, the one that I just blathered on about first, and then we're going to take a small break and go into the second and third topics here. So I want to talk about the basics of subdivision design. So on the right hand, you could see it could be an urban fabric kind of a thing, lots and blocks or lots set up around cul-de-sacs. It could be more open lands where you're trying to protect sensitive lands, even in an urban context, by moving the development away from the lands you're trying to protect. So those are just images. But I do want to talk about the kinds of things when somebody comes in and says, I want to plat new lots, it's annexed land or it's unused land, it's infill land. I want to plat new lots. And the city reviews it and says, good enough. These are good lots. What is it reviewing? First of all, are the lot layouts the way you want? Is the pattern of lots? Is it urban? Is it curvilinear? Often there's an established fabric. How important is it to reinforce that fabric? If it's in an alley loaded area where everybody has alleys, is it important to continue those alleys? You do not want to have, some cities don't want to have a mix and match. This is a kind of a suburban block, and next to it is an urban block, and next to it's a suburban block. Frontage. How much frontage should each lot have on the street? I realize it's getting technical, but that has to do with, how do I lay this out? Okay, the city tells me I have to plat my land. Oh, I'd like 1,000 lots. No, you can't do that. There's minimum lot sizes, there's frontage. And the issue here is often bigger frontages drive up infrastructure costs. Back in the day, much of our older cities were platted with 25-foot frontages. So just making the math easy, if you had a 400-foot lot and you have 400-foot long block and you have 25, 4 times 4, that's 16 lots facing that street. The utility charges, the price of doing pipes and wires in that street, are divided over 16 lots. It increases the cost of those lots less than if you had, after World War II, we sometimes had zone districts with a minimum lot size of 70 feet. Well, you can do the math yourself. If that's 70 feet within a 400-foot block, that's about 6 lots less. So the infrastructure cost of building the road, building the infrastructure, the pipes, the wires, is spread over 6 lots, not 16 lots. Those lots are going to be more expensive. And so over time, people have got to say, well, if there's a reason, if we're reinforcing character and it's important to us, we could have big ones, but beware of the cost of what you're doing when you do that, because there's a trade-off between character and cost. Street patterns. No secret to anybody here. Old cities were largely platted on grids. New ones are on, often in the post-war area with curvilinear streets, sometimes connecting, sometimes deliberately not connecting because nobody wanted through connectivity. And in sensitive land areas, often trying to minimize the intrusion you have on steep slopes or crossing waterways. And so what is the desired street pattern, and does it differ based on the different areas of the cities? Cities also got to look at the private street rights of ways and easements. Basically, again, in the post-war era, there were a lot of standards written which basically said wide streets are great. People can drive without hitting each other. And we realized 40, 50 years later and said, wow, that also means the cars go pretty fast. That's not pretty safe. The streets are too wide to cross easily. So there's an issue here. How do you coordinate the fabric that you want to create in different parts of the cities with the standards for streets? And by the way, the trend is to try to narrow them for cost reasons and for walkability reasons. And, if I'd said 25, 30 years ago, slow the cars down, narrow the streets so the cars have to slow down, people would laugh at me. Now that's a very common discussion. No, we want the cars to slow down. We want the people to be able to walk across more safely and not have to cross as much land. And as we all age, that's important. The hidden issue here is private streets. Because of the affordability challenges we have talked about before, and the fact that city engineering departments may not want the streets wide. Sometimes they want them wide, and the fire department wants them wide so fire engines can get through. Planners tend to want them narrow, but you reach a compromise. They got to be at least this size for this type of street for a compromise between desire with the narrow tensions. And they have to be built to last. Engineering folks, because the city has to maintain many of these, have to demand that they actually be built to last, which means they're expensive. They're not going to crumble in 5 years. The response to that in the private sector sometimes is, well, I don't want to meet those. That's driving my costs up. I want to do private streets. I will not dedicate them to you. So you don't have to worry about how long they last. I'll take care of them. And that creates, we can go down that road if you like. But in general, most cities want to see the private street standards be pretty close to the public street standards. They don't want to narrow the streets or make them lighter in weight and less durable because they worry that even though that drives down the cost, eventually those streets will need to be maintained And if they can't be maintained privately, they'll wind up back being maintained by the city, and the city will say, that's pretty expensive to maintain. Who approved this? Answer, we approved private streets. But then why are we doing it? Well, because they fell apart and the systems we had in place to maintain them didn't work. So that is something that comes into subdivision standards. What not only what the network of streets is, are there two sets of standards for these things? And there's a tension there again. It's cheaper to do streets that are not as wide or as durably built as the city usually wants to have for streets that it wants. And so there's a trade-off there. Public improvements, the standards you have for water, sewer, utilities, and irrigation. Sometimes, even though we're going to talk about landscaping in July, sometimes there are requirements in subdivision that say, when you lay out a new subdivision, we're not going to talk about individual lot landscaping or landscaping along each street, because we got that covered in other ways. But we do talk about we don't talk about lot landscaping, but we sometimes talk about the edges of where your subdivision comes up against the road or your neighbors does have to be landscaped and buffered, or up against open space. Hey, you're planting lands next to open space, you got to put in buffers and landscaping. And actually that often happens along trees. We're not going to talk about your parking lots. That's lot by lot. We're not going to talk about your edges of your lots. We are going to talk about where your lot comes up to the street, because that has to do with the character and the fabric of our public street network. So I'm just pointing out that there are many topics that are addressed in this fundamental thing of the framework of development within which zoning operates. So what does Blueprint Boise say about this? It says, address residential subdivision and private rights of way drainage. I put that on as a bullet. I didn't dwell on it. In many newer codes, for the sake of affordability, we've talked about this, lots get smaller. If lots get smaller, so there can be more, or not every lot, but some lots are allowed to be very small, and setbacks of buildings from the lot lines get to be lower for the sake of efficiency. And that can create drainage problems, because now there's very little land for the rainwater that falls on your property to get off your property without interfering with your neighbor's property. And so there's a tension there about that, and Blueprint Boise addressed some of that. Foothills, we'll talk about later in sensitive lands, but it also says regulated to avoid environmentally sensitive areas, water bodies, floodways, landslides, fault zones, steep slopes, etc. And then adopt subdivision standards necessary to prevent the establishment of uses that are noise sensitive and conflict with the safe operations of the airport. So one way this happens, zoning can say, hey, it's an airport. We don't want gatherings of people, schools, nursing homes, churches. We don't want those things near the airport because those are sensitive lands, and it's a lot of people. And if anything went wrong, a lot of people are at risk. And by the way, we also don't want residential where it's going to be affected by noise. So that is often, it can be done through zoning, i.e. you can't do that in this lot. But it is also sometimes done in subdivision, where you basically say, we're not going to let you create residentially sized lots out here, that we know what happens to those. You create those lots, you told us they were going to be an office park, the office park market went away, you asked this council to rezone you for residential. Now we have residential near the airport, we didn't want that. And so it can be addressed both through zoning and through subdivision. So that's what Blueprint Boise says. I did want to talk about, just to see the discussion, the clustering as one of the major topics. I talked about street networks. We're going to talk about that later in access and connectivity. Talked about sensitive lands. That's coming up after the break. So other than street networks and connectivity, one of the major things that's coming up, street networks and sensitive land, is clustering. The images on the right show you the concept. You guys are maybe familiar because Boise already uses this in the foothills. So the right-hand top image is simply old style subdivision. We call it cookie cutter. You've got a right to X lot. Your lot size is whatever it is, 5,000 square feet. And you've got a plot of land that is, let's multiply it out, 40,000 square feet. You got a right to 8 lots. Draw your lines and record it. And we'll just make sure that we've required you to put utilities in there, but go ahead. This is an extreme case, but obviously the problems with that is you had a creek, you had a waterway, you don't want lots to ignore the terrain. And so clustering simply means, down at the bottom, the requirement, either an incentive or a requirement to say, in areas with a more rural character or a more open space character or a larger lot character, we're going to require you to put the same number of lots or more lots on the least sensitive parts of the land, or the least visible parts of the land, or the least compromised parts of the land, the least visible, as I said. So the way it normally works is in codes, in your foothills, you do this, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Forget the foothills for now. What about the rest of the city? Where do you want to go with this? Because it has several advantages. A, it allows the developer to respect natural features, protect rock outcroppings, protect waterways, protect wetlands, protect wildlife corridors, and usually still get the same number of lots. So the classic way of doing this would be to say, okay, if we just took your minimum lot size, divided it by your parcel, you have the right to X lots. Stay away from all the sensitive stuff, and we will let you have X lots or X plus 2. Frankly, we don't care about the number of lots. We care about you staying away from the sensitive lands. In older codes, they'd say, here's a carrot. Here's 2 more lots for doing the right thing. I will say that in newer codes, they sometimes say, this is not a carrot, this is a requirement. You're gonna stay away from things, and we're gonna give you 2 more lots for doing it. Or this is not a choice. So obviously the advantages are more open space can be protected. Open space can be concentrated in these priority areas. More consistent management of the open space that if you tried to do it on each lot. If you look at that top right image, there's a lot of open space. It's just going to be managed as a yard and probably managed differently by the 9 lot owners in that area because it's their private open space. The bottom one is more likely to be shared open space. Does not have to be open to the public. I want to be clear about that. It's pretty hard to make that open to the public. So it's likely to be usable by those lot owners, but it's going to be managed by an HOA or managed under some common scheme that says, this is what we're trying to achieve with the open space. And again, the infrastructure costs on clustering are often a lot lower because you are running those pipes and wires over a shorter area of land. The disadvantages is it's simply a market one. I've had this discussion in a lot of communities, and they say, Don, it makes all the sense in the world, but my market, they want to buy acreage. They want big acreage. They want to control their acreage. They don't mind mowing their acreage. They would, if you told them that the bottom right image had greater views and now you don't have to look over your neighbor's lots, you're looking over a combined open space, they would say, I don't care. I moved out to buy acreage and I want to control that acreage. And again, so it's a matter of kind of protected outlots that are jointly managed versus open lots. And again, the bottom line, what if the surrounding area is not clustered? What if the established fabric of that area is not? In the fringes of cities, you sometimes have an area where the grid of streets kind of peters out, or the subdivision of streets, the curvilinear post-war lots are beautiful, they're working out, but now you have raw land. And on the one hand, clustering would be a good thing for all the advantages pointed out here, but it would be inconsistent with what's next door. Next door, they have done fairly, medium to large size curvilinear lots, subdivision lots, which sold like hotcakes and are very valuable and people love them. So there's this inconsistency in fabric between the two. So here's the question, the question before the break. So again, clustering of new development lots can often result in the preservation of more open space, reduce the infrastructure costs. Should your regulations require instead of just allowing this? Should this be the de facto? Or, and we tried to state it in a few words on one slide, or should it be more kind of contextual? It's required for raw land in certain areas identified in Blueprint Boise, and in other areas we don't, because it would be inconsistent with the existing walkable fabric or the suburban fabric of the city. Should it be more contextual, or should it be kind of the default unless you need, or unless the plan calls for a different character in that area? I think that's our question, and then we'll do a break. So that's the question. Should it be required versus then just encouraged or allowed? And here, I'm going to put this slide back up just so that you can look back and refer back to this if you'd like to in making comments. So does anybody have any thoughts about, and again, that's the question. But if you want to talk about other aspects of subdivision, have at it.
Ian, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that, at least my opinion, as far as my limited understanding of it is, I think clustering should be probably required where it's relevant to the existing, character, or if there is no existing character for that matter. I mean, I think it's interesting. My opinion is this clustering actually kind of maintains the existing character of the site and makes it more interesting as a development. Makes it more interesting to design as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
And Byron.
Thank you. Don, I just have a question. So in other areas where it has become a requirement, how do these jurisdictions get around oddball parcels and parcels in which this sort of conflicts as a blanket requirement with, I guess, the specificity of some inconvenient topographical features, right? We're always going to have exceptions to this rule. So how do they deal with those?
Well, actually, it's designed to deal with those. It's a newer subdivision ordinance say, look, the first step in this process is not to show us your preliminary plat. By the way, for the non-zoning geeks, the way this happens is that the applicant reads your code, comes in with a drawing of where they want to put the lots. That's called a preliminary plat. It goes through a hearing process because in the end, the city is probably going to have to maintain the streets that you're laying out. And so the city and the city is going to have to make sure the utilities work. So it's going to go to a hearing, and it's one way or another going to be approved by city council because you are building the fabric of the city and they are responsible for some costs in the long run. So they do not want to approve it or have it just foisted upon them. So that's how it happens. You turn in a preliminary plat. The public hearing process says, yeah, this is right, that's wrong, fix it. You go back, fix it, and bring it back, and that is what's filed. So there's at least a two-step process that says, okay, there's no legal document until you file the plat. Now you can sell lots. In newer codes, they would start with where you started, Byron, and they would say, actually, it's a three-step process. First thing you show us is a land analysis. You identify rock outcroppings, you identify wetlands, you identify creeks and drainages, you identify some places they even say, this land is highly visible. So identify the lots that are located on ridge lines because we'd like you not to build on the ridge lines. So everybody has to stare at your house. You love it. You can see the views. Everybody else has to stare at your house. Sometimes so they identify and they say, show us a land analysis that reflects the things we've listed in the code that we want you to stay away from. And we'll review that with you informally. No public hearing. We'll just review that informally. And we'll say, good, we think you got it right. Or no, you still say you want to build. Guys, I'm not making a judgment here. You still putting all your houses on the ridge line. We don't want it there. Our code says don't do it there. And so go back and fix it. So that's informal. And then the plan is fine. So I don't know if I'm missing your point, but actually clustering, the reason clustering exists is primarily to deal with weird topographic and geological and soil features. Its side benefits are open space character and preserving views, things like that. So.
Thank you, Don. Yeah, it sounds like it's procedural. The answer is more procedural than, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
But you do list in the code the things that you need to regulate. For example, if the code does not say ridge lines are important to us, and the guy brings in his land analysis and city says, we'd like you not to build on the ridge lines, the applicant's perfectly in their rights to say, if you want a law saying don't build on the ridge lines, you put it in your code. You don't make it up as you go along. You can't just raise whatever occurs to you when I lay a drawing out in front of you. So you do have to get it in the code. You have to name the things that you would like to have that are based in Blueprint Boise, but if you don't name them, you're not going to be able to raise them along the way. So you got to think about it ahead of time.
All right, we have Richard.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this certainly looks positive to me. I mean, and certainly at least to allow it. As it's been explained to me, this wasn't, and maybe that's not correct, but a straight subdivision, if it wasn't a PUD, this essentially wouldn't be allowed. And that, as I understood it, was a big reason to have PUDs. And clearly, as you pointed out, there's other complications with those. So to allow sounds great. I guess whether or not to require it, I guess so much of that, as you just pointed out, would depend on what we would determine as those important features to avoid. But I see this as a positive thing, most definitely to allow. And if we can come up with good criteria of valuable areas to avoid, then that would also be positive. So thanks.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah. Real quick, Don, help me out with one thing on the top example. Say the 100-year floodplain wasn't there, the riparian area wasn't there. It was pancake flat.
Mhm.
If clustering was still required in that scenario, would it almost act as a quasi like lot coverage condition to where you say you have X amount of this large area to put parcels on, the rest will be preserved for open space? Or
That's a very good question, and the answer is yes. When people require clustering, or even incent clustering, you start with the land analysis, you identify the features, but say it's flat prairie land, but or it's got nothing significant. A city that did that would do it because they want to preserve the open space character, or that subdivision, if it's platted with 9 lots that were just a house on each lot, is going to compromise the value of either the view from the road there or the view behind it. And so they would say, all right, so it's not funky land. There's nothing there on the land itself to preserve, but we want you to preserve the open space character. So you are going to need to put 50% of the lot of the site area in open space. You choose, but you cluster the rest of it in the following ways. So.
Thank you. That helps.
And Patrick.
Thanks. Building off of what Mr. Alexander just asked, like, do we, would this be the case with every new subdivision? So this would prevent us from ever allowing something like the North End or what have you, where you have like a grid structure and say that every new subdivision has to be a mixture of open space and developed area everywhere forever? Now, I understand we're not doing that for new subdivisions.
Well, I think you've answered your own question.
Yeah.
Answered your own question. I can't say yes to that. No,
Sure.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Patrick. The short answer is, if in those jurisdictions where clustering is mandatory, it usually only applies to raw land development. So, for example, if you were rich and you bought a block of a half a block of lots in an established area of the city and you wanted to replat it, you would not have to cluster. They usually apply it to raw land or redevelopment parcels. And that's why I raised earlier, normally they would say, unless the established character on the lots surrounding this is alley loaded, in which case we want you to do alley loaded, or is of a different character. It usually is applied to raw land as it's brought into the city, and it usually has outs for various purposes, but not just because you don't want to, not just because you feel like doing a cookie cutter subdivision. So it becomes the default for raw land subdivisions.
Thanks. I appreciate that. The outs, I think, matter quite a bit. I mean, I think about what's happening in a place called Harris Ranch. I don't know how much you know about that development in South Boise, where they have denser areas that have like sort of a grid system. They definitely have open space preserved in certain areas, but would this have prevented us from creating a place like Harris Ranch if we had required clustering? I guess maybe is a good way to phrase my question.
I do not know the fabric of Harris Ranch enough to answer that question.
Okay, so I would be concerned about the outs and potential unintended consequences if this was required in all cases. But as a general rule, between the top image and the bottom image, I think the bottom image is better, especially with the same number of lots.
Okay. Well, clue me in just a little bit. Say one more sentence about what out you would have liked to have to avoid an unintended consequence. I don't know Harris Ranch, but I need to hear what you're thinking of.
Well, if you want to have a new development, it technically is open land, but you wanted to have a more urban character. But do we require a semi-rural character with open space on every new plot? It might be an unintended consequence of this.
Thanks, I got it.
All right, Esther.
Hello, everyone. So I was just thinking of this and then how it relates to planned PUDs, because when I was looking at the slides, I was thinking of a proposal called Plano Development, which was proposed in Northwest Boise, not as far northwest as Richard Llewellyn, but off of Collister on the northwest, in the northwest foothill of the intersection of Hill Road and Collister. There was some open land. It was a development company from Utah working with a local landowner. And due to the steepness and also sensitive plants, and because it was considered a planned unit, and I guess maybe the question, Don, to you is, what is the difference between a PUD and this type of subdivision? Because the PUD actually promoted a higher density in one location with preservation or conservation of the landscape in other areas. And I think they got, don't quote me on this, I may be completely off because it's been many years. I think they got to put extra houses in the location based on the amount of, based on how much open space they were leaving.
Yeah. The short answer to your question is PUDs, this could be done through a PUD, and the example that you're talking about sounds like it was done through a PUD. So yes, you could do this through a PUD. Clustering regulations in subdivision, remember what I said, right hand, left hand. PUDs are kind of both hands holding together. I got a deal for you. It's a combination of zoning and how I want to lay this out, which has to do with subdivision. So I'm going to go bring this forward, and I want a deal that would be both zoning and subdivision. Clustering in subdivision regulations is an alternative path that says, I don't need rezoning, nor do I want to go through a political process to rezoning. I'm satisfied with the density and the type of development. It's residential density, and I bought the land, and I know I could have a right to build 25 houses. I don't want to get this rezoned, and I don't want to get a political approval. I want to get subdivided, and the city would say, great, you get 25 houses or 27, however you'd say, give you a bonus. But you don't need to go, because these things are, you're not negotiating. The zoning is not up for grabs. It is simply how you lay out the lots. So this would go forward not as a combined zoning and PUD deal. It would simply say the guy has zoning, he's filed a plat, we're digging to a public hearing, and here's how he wants to lay out the roads and lots, and that's consistent with our clustering, but we're not negotiating the land uses or other lot size. All he's doing is clustering or not clustering the layout of the lots within the zoning that they already have. So you can do it through PUDs. I think I've talked about this before, but most newer codes want to avoid putting people through PUDs if there is another way of doing it, just because they turn out to be very time and labor intensive going down the road.
Thank you.
Andrea, if we don't have any more hands, we've gone about 48 minutes, something like that. I would suggest we do a break sooner rather than, oh, I see that Daniel has his hand up. So after that, because we have two big topics after the break, that I'd almost rather take the break a little early and save that time for later after Daniel.
Absolutely. Daniel.
Great, thanks. So Don, maybe following up a bit on Patrick's remark. So is there, if it is required, is there a limit? Are there size limits so that you can say, so because I could imagine if you're saying, hey, we're doing, I don't know, 50 acres, it's like, yes, let's definitely do that. There's a scale where you definitely want to be doing this and taking a broad look at the, but if it's like, you know, I don't know, if it's 2 acres, well then, no, I wouldn't want you to, you know, something, because you've definitely seen this can run amok, you know, like there's a low pot, and some people call it a wetlands, and they say, well, no, it's a riparian area, and so we're going to draw a huge area around it, and you know what, we're not going to get any houses there. So I mean, that's a separate issue in terms of how what we classify as wetlands. But I think the bigger point is, are there, when you have these, when it's a requirement, do cities create an escape valve either by size or some other way where they don't have to, or not required to basically build open space into the site beyond what's already part of the code.
Yeah,
part of the zoning
the
code.
answer is yeah. The answer is yes. Some cities do not put a minimum size on it, but most do, and I would recommend that you do for exactly the reasons that you've said. It reminds me of several of these comments remind me of the old adage, there's nothing more dangerous than a good idea if it's the only one you have. It's kind of, even if it sounds great, trying to apply it everywhere is a problem. So,
right.
The answer is yes.
And Drew has a question as well. So let's follow up with Drew.
Just real quick, I saw access and connectivity on the agenda. Is that as it relates to subdivisions or just broadly?
I wanted to have a more in-depth discussion about that after the break, so it's going to come up again.
With subdivisions as the topic?
Well, the next two topics we have, sensitive lands and access and connectivity, are interesting parts of zoning ordinances because in newer codes, they often have two subsets. They say sensitive lands, here's what you need to do when you're subdividing. Here's the additional things you have to do through zoning. And the same is through access and connectivity. Usually it has a section that says, this is what you do at the subdivision stage. And then we have other things you need to do at the zoning stage to make sure you've got good connectivity. So both of those relate both to subdivision and to zoning. So they're kind of a bridge between this session and the next session.
Okay, I'll let us take a break then.
Great. Okay.
All right. So let's everybody take a 5-minute break and stretch or get a beverage or use the restroom. And then we will see you back and we will kick off to our sensitive land section.
Great.
All right. How is everybody doing? Are we refreshed and ready to get going? All right, Drew's giving me the thumbs up. So, Dawn, I'm going to hand it over and let you take it over.
Andrea, are we ready to go, or shall we give a few minutes?
Nope, I think we're ready. Can you hear me? Drew, you got me? Just not Dawn.
I think I've been unmuted.
All right, Dawn, can you hear me now?
Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? I can't tell whether Andrea can hear me or anybody else can. Okay, I guess I'm heard. Okay.
Don, can you hear me? Maybe Don can't hear anybody.
Dawn's audio
All
must
right.
be having trouble.
I'm hearing Andrea say, let's go ahead and go. So let's go. Sorry for the delay. So let's move on to sensitive lands here. I want to cover both this and the access and connectivity, so we can still leave some time for public comment at the end of this. But sensitive lands, again, systems. These are systems that you want to build in and protect to begin with. Currently, you in the Boise ordinance talks about, so I wish I hadn't animated these, but this is what you've got. You've got the Boise River system, which I should have put these in other orders, is a broader area defined locally, which is more than floodplains. It tends to be around the floodplains area. Floodplains are FEMA largely. It is related in almost every city pretty closely to federal standards to try to keep the city qualified and hopefully at good insurance rates for federal flood insurance and reinsurance. So flood protection is tied to FEMA. We are seldom asked to update those unless the state is updating their version of FEMA. I have not heard that that's part of this work. Boise River system is broader than that. It goes back around, its goal is to protect fish and wildlife, riparian wetland areas, and recreation from development along the Boise River. So it is an optional Boise-driven set of fairly complicated regulations about what you can do in and around the rivers that is not related to flood protection. It's related to character and wildlife and open space. In addition, as all of you very well know, you've got the hillside foothills development standards. And it is, again, fairly complicated set of standards relating to slope, erosion, unstable soils, talking about all these things. What can you do for grading? How do you need to revegetate it? Erosion control, hydrologic control, roadways. How do you lay out streets and roadways to get through it, and maintenance standards. And then you have airport controls. I'm happy to have this conversation go anywhere. I'll do a little bit more about this, but most of the discussion so far has been about hillside so far. I have not had a lot of comment. Everybody loves, it seems, or likes or values the hillside protections around Boise. Not many people have suggested Boise River system or floodplain. So just to telegraph, we're not anticipating making significant changes to those unless somebody raises an issue. Foothills, we do want to talk about a little bit, not to change them, but to draw you out on them since they are the hot topic in sensitive lands. And then the airport area, which tends to be largely a technical exercise in working with the airport authority and working through federal aviation part 77 regulations to make sure you're aligned with what the feds want you to do around those areas. And it can go further, but foothills is basically, and wildlife and other wildlife you've got also. Oops, wildfire. I'm sorry, airport you've got. But wildfire and wildlife are things that are increasingly protected or addressed in subdivision in particular. These are areas where basically, once you lay out the subdivision, you either have protected wildlife through the corridors and habitats, or you have not. It's very hard to go into an individual lot at the lot development size and say, wildlife and wildfire protection. The usual answer is, if you wanted me away from that, why did you plat my lot there? That's not true of everywhere, but it is true in these two cases. And frankly, my personal opinion is that most communities in the West are not taking wildfire seriously enough in order to see what's going to come down the road in terms of risks. But anyway, that's it. I did want to talk about, here's what I'm moving on to foothills, and we'll open up and take comments on any of these topics or other sensitive lands topics. But in foothills now, what does it say? You do cluster. You do have clustering requirements based on goals that are unique to the foothill standards. You've got density bonuses for protecting more than the required amount of open space. You can see the figures there. If you do 25% of open space, you get a 0.5 DU per acre bonus. If you do 63%, you get 2.25, and there's a gradation in between. It's a sliding scale. You've got requirements on cut and fill being minimized in the foothill areas and building envelopes. Now, the graphic on the right is just to show you, very, very often in zoning, the zoning says, okay, you got a lot. You need to set the building back, and that's the dotted line that's inside the outside boundaries. The building cannot be too near to your neighbors. How close is too near? We just drew it for you. It's 5 feet, it's 20 feet, it's 10 feet, it's whatever your neighbors have. It's fine. On sensitive lands, it is often true that you define a building envelope. I know I could build it anywhere in that gray line, dotted line, but I am hereby committing to develop it on the least sensitive part of that land. So I am, if it's wetlands, I'll keep it as far from the wetlands as possible. If it's ridge lines, I'll keep it off the ridge line as much as possible. And in the planning process, they not only draw the streets and the lots, they draw building envelopes on the lots, or they come up with a process saying, okay, we did your plat, but before we'll give you a building permit for a house, you're going to come in and define building envelopes. You've already got that in the foothills right now. So that's what you currently have. And then you have a prohibition on gated entrances. And again, just like the disturbance of cut and fill, you've got sensitive lands. You've got the avoidance of roads crossing sensitive lands as much as possible. So this is what you've got in layman's terms today. And what I wanted to raise is these general issues of sensitive lands, and we'll go to the question. But again, here are the things you could talk. We want to make sure we get, because it's a fundamental framework. Have you thought in this area, in the sensitive lands areas, do you think they're adequate to deal with what climate change is going to bring in terms of wildfire events and flooding events? And again, just throwing it out there, since this is such a hot topic in Boise, are there ways to make it better? Either by making it less time consuming to get through the process, or protecting wildlife habitats and corridors, or helping with the affordable housing challenge. Remember, people love foothills. You've got them. You've got very extensive regulations. Just asking the question, have you addressed what you want to address? Do you want to improve it in any way? Is there any more guidance you'd like to give us about that? And ... If you have a comment and it's not on foothills, but it's on something else, happy to take that comment too about things Boise should be doing on sensitive lands. So here's the question, I guess. And here's what Blueprint Boise says: encouraging high quality design and maintenance of stormwater management, flood mitigation in floodplain areas. This is just about sensitive lands. Zoning and development standards for rail corridors, such as a mitigation matrix for non-combustible roofs, has to do with wildfire. And then this wildland interface, which is also related to wildfire. So there's language in Blueprint Boise about this. And here's the question. So everybody loves hillsides in Boise. It sounds like, are there ways in which we could increase them? Just throw it out for you. Andrea, I don't know if you're going to moderate this or not. Are you going to moderate or
Yep,
why?
Go ahead, Chris.
Hi. Okay. So my question, I guess, is more of a clarification. Can you hear me? Can Don hear me?
I can hear you.
Don, can you hear me? I can put it in the chat if that would make it easier.
We may have to. I've gone ahead and alerted Don that he has some audio issues.
Well, I'll post it in the chat just to save some time and see if he can read that.
Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear Don.
Yeah. I'm getting the chat around here suggesting that some people cannot hear me. So I don't know where to go with this. Since most of you have nodded, at least the ones whose pictures are shown are nodding and saying that they're, everyone can hear you, you cannot hear us, I'm sorry. Okay. For lack of a better idea, I'm going to log off and log back on and hope it's better the next time around. So I'm going to get off of here. So sorry.
Okay, Don's gonna see if he can't work out some of his technical issues. But we can all think about that question. We do have things that regulate some of our sensitive lands, but are there things that we are missing? And I don't know, Chris, if you want to hold off and wait for Don. Richard, do you want to hold off, or would you like to share with the group now?
Well, I have a question.
Let's
and maybe
try it again. Can you hear me now?
I'll shut up.
Yes, we got you.
Can you hear us now?
Oh, no.
Sounds like he might be still having trouble with his audio.
Yeah, it is.
Maybe if he did a
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
We can always hear you.
Somebody say something so I see if I can hear you.
Can you hear us?
Somebody say something.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah.
Maybe we just post the,
I'll try the headphones.
chat and have him read them out.
Yeah, I think the headphones might help.
Yes.
Try it back on headphones. Somebody say something?
Can you hear us now?
Hello?
Yeah, it wouldn't go onto my speakers, but it will do headphones. So I can hear you now, with apologies to all of you.
All right.
Apologize. Sorry.
No, Chris is ready, and then we're
Yeah.
gonna follow it up by Richard.
Thanks.
Excellent. So I guess my question is more clarification regarding the Boise River part. So a lot of the topics have been about the hillsides and the foothills. But with the Boise River, are there, in what we have currently, protections in place for this area that we would then just continue? So for example, like there's greenbelt areas throughout most of the city limits, and I think almost all the way to the far eastern end. So to me, it's a little unclear if there's a lot that needs to be changed about that, or if we're just trying to continue the existing protections along the river.
I believe that we have heard some endorsements of it, and I've not heard heard anybody asking us to change them. So we're intending to carry them forward unless someone tells us otherwise.
Thank you.
So I'm going to add one caveat. So what I have heard is individuals asking for additional wildlife urban interface criteria. So specific to plantings, those types of things, or appropriate building materials, just making it more codified rather than just being a zone. I've also heard that it's important for us to look at our landscape species that we allow, especially in wildlife corridors. So we've oftentimes heard of the yew impacting some of our wildlife in a negative way, as it's a poisonous substance to deer and those type of species. So we've been asked in those regards to start to include some of that.
Can I clarify, Andrea, is that particular to foothills, or is that in general that people have asked you for those to be addressed generally within Boise?
Most specifically in the foothills for wildland urban interface as well as species. But we have been asked citywide to look at some species that might be poisonous to animals as they migrate or integrate into that urban fabric.
Okay, got it.
All right, Francis, go ahead.
Hi, I missed everything that you said. My audio seemed to be unstable, so I'm sorry. Can you give me the 10-second repeat of what you were just talking about, Andrea? Because I think it had to do with my question. I was wondering what the current zoning says about wildlife.
We have been asked to identify poisonous plantings in order to preserve wildlife and get them out of a danger zone so that they are not ingesting that. So the U was one that was specifically brought to our attention by the Idaho Fish and Game.
Uh-huh. And are there specific wildlife corridors that are protected throughout the city, or how is the diminishing habitat for a wildlife being addressed?
So currently we do not have any protected corridors. One of the most predominant corridors that might be located in the city of Boise is actually located in Harris Ranch. And they did try and preserve that migration corridor. And that migration corridor also happens to follow the Idaho Power easement. So they have created that type of open space and clustered around that. So they've identified that, yes, that's a wildlife corridor that's important to our deer and elk during those wintering seasons. And so they've clustered development outside of there in order to preserve that. But that's the only corridor that I can think of in the city at this time.
Okay. And I was contacted by somebody from the Golden Audubon Society who was saying that some of their membership they thought they had contacted the planning department to talk about birds and greater protections for birds as the city grows. Is that a dialogue that's taking place right now?
So yes, we have made contact with them, and they have provided us with some guidance in hopes that we can help with bird strikes. And that would be specific to like building materials, glazing, those types of things that we can think about as we move forward and grow.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So just to add to that, though, your current Boise River overlay, or your Boise River systems overlay, does refer to the Boise River Fish and Wildlife Habitat Study as a factor to be taken into account in the management of it. If you're in that overlay, it references a wildlife habitat study that is supposed to be reflected in the regulations and the approvals given within that overlay. So you got Harris Ranch and you got Boise River System as the ones that are already referenced.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other thoughts of this? I don't, Al.
Richard.
Great, thank you. I probably have too many thoughts to be very coherent about it right now. But let's start with, the kind of small farmstead landscape, which is something that's not, I don't think, really recognized by Boise. It does have some features, kind of on a smaller micro scale, not the kinds of wildlife corridors that Fish and Game would designate, but things that traditionally served, fence lines, laterals, easements for laterals and the trees that would tend to grow along those, canals, all those things that kind of created those kinds of, I call them the bones of the this kind of landscape, and that traditionally we're also kind of shared spaces. If we could have some recognition of those things, I mean, they don't, they're not going to serve as major wildlife corridors anymore, but they could be very important still for, songbirds, pollinators, as well, potentially as trails. So I'll just throw that out there. The other thing I'd like to say real quickly is, I think if anything, we should really think about expanding thermal protection for the river. In some places, as things warm up and as, cold water becomes more and more critical and important, the more I think we may need to look at increasing shading for the river rather than diminishing it. And I know that other jurisdictions, Garden City doesn't really kind of follow our, that they don't have our value in that right now. And so we may need to make up for that on some level. So thank you.
So this is, Richard, your comment is a good one, and a bridge to the July meeting as well, because just to telegraph ahead, the fundamental thing to get right at the start is these systems, drainage systems, wildlife corridors, street systems, open space systems, things that can't be put back together very easily once you've failed to protect the connectivity, the continuity, as much of it as you want from property to property. But you've raised, your small farmstead comment raises the fact that sensitive lands are sometimes also addressed in the zoning ordinance. Okay, you got a lot, but within that lot, you have some areas of sensitive lands, and we would like you to lay your development out on a given lot. Yes, it's not part of a macro framework, but the nature of your property does have the potential for wildlife, enhancing wildlife, and therefore that's a choice to make. But I wanted to point out that's one of the examples of how wildlife sometimes is addressed at it when it has to be addressed. Sometimes addressed at the framework level, but that also could be addressed at the zoning level. So that may come up again.
And we have Ian with a comment as well.
Yeah, I think Richard brought up a good point about tree coverage. And this might be a question for you, Andrea. I'm not as familiar is there a tree overlay, or is that somehow incorporated into the Boise River overlay, or is it somehow related into the, if you're building on a site, there's a certain caliper of tree that you can remove, any larger than that you can't. I guess, how does that work?
So the city currently has a tree mitigation policy. Ultimately, it says that if I remove a 14-inch caliper tree that is in good health, so we have to assume that it's in good health and it's contributing to our system, then you would have to replace that many calipers. So then you could replace that with 7 2-inch caliper trees, or you could, do that by some other type of divisibility, but you ultimately have to replace that. Now, what we have run into in the past is that, some site is highly forested, and as we remove those trees, there is no room to replace that many calipers. So we do need to evaluate how that is. Our legal staff has taken a look at, is there a way that somebody could contribute monetarily to, like, the Parks Fund, to plant elsewhere throughout the city to mitigate for that. And they don't seem very receptive to that. So we ultimately need to evaluate, is there a tree preservation that's appropriate that we would like to consider as part of this ordinance? Is there a better way to mitigate? And, we oftentimes hear that 2-inch caliper trees, they don't serve the same purpose as that much larger ones. So we can't avoid the heat island effect. We can't cool our waters and those other types of things that are there. So, we have to weigh all of that very carefully.
Just to follow up, thank you for the response. That helps clarify. As the city of trees, I think that should be something that's prioritized. I understand that, on a very wooded site, you also have to respect people's rights to kind of build on their own property. I also am kind of concerned that, the question of whether or not it is a healthy tree often, at least in my past experience, has come into play where if you get the right arborist to look at your tree, then it's not healthy. So I would be interested in how we incorporate that, whether that's just to specific areas like the river or heavily wooded areas within the city. But thank you.
So I'd like to just say, so I think there are two levels on that comment of tree protection canopy and its operation. Could relate to the Boise River area, to Richard's comment, and the river in particular is something that needs to be cooled. It'll also come up in July because tree protection and the degree and the way it works and what you can and can't remove and how you mitigate is usually done at the site level. So I'll take your comment as both a concern at the site level, but also a concern at the system level.
Yes. And we have Drew up next.
Just real quickly to piggyback on what Ian was saying, I think there's a lot of truth there. We're the city of trees. There's a lot of importance there. One system I just recently stumbled across, I was visiting Ole Miss, and they have a system where they place a value on each tree based on the type of tree it is, age, growth, or caliper even. So in line with what we may have just mentioned, maybe that's an area we could explore for that sensitivity. If you can't replace up to that on the site, the remaining amount gets kicked into a mitigation fund for placement elsewhere in the city or something like that. I just thought it was a cool concept that takes it maybe a step further than the caliper approach that we have now.
Thank you.
Shall we move on to the access and connectivity? We're taking notes. You're taking notes. I know Diane Cushland's taking notes as we go along. I don't want to rush, but I want to make sure we don't run out of time for that one because I predict there's going to be significant discussion. So,
yeah. Well, it's now 4:24, so let's go ahead and move on. We do have two attendees that I'd like to leave some time at the end that if they'd like to present any information or introduce themselves, we can do that.
Okay, great. I am trying again after the glitch to share screen properly. Can you guys see? That? Are we showing the 2 version or the 1 version?
You are showing the 2-pane version.
Ah, boy. So here, let's see if I can get it swapped, but it's not cooperating. Sometimes it doesn't cooperate very well. So I'm going to stop share and try it again. Just a second. Let's try to. Oh, I know. Let me try something else here. Just a second. There we go. Let me try something else. How about that? Better? Or am I still on 2?
I don't see anything at this point.
Sorry, it's not that funny, but still, that's whatever can go wrong will go wrong. So give me one more try on this. Yeah, we're still back on 2. All right. So in the interest of time, if I get a chance to swap it out, I will, but my dashboard is not being very friendly right now, so it may not work that well. Let's try this. You do see the 2 version, do you see the 2 version now, or do you see nothing at all?
We see a singular pane with the preview on the left-hand side, but
Okay.
we're fine. Go ahead.
All right, let's go ahead. Yep, in the interest of time, I just want to do it. Let's just go up to the next topic and just, I'll just apologize for not being very technological savvy right now. Let's go on and go to the next one. Here we go. Oh, access and connectivity. I did want to just talk in general about access and connectivity. The graphics in this case are not what I want to talk about. So I don't know who animated all this. Transit connections. Here's the things that increasingly subdivisions, and then in some cases also zoning address related to this. Once again, when we talk about access and connectivity, our outline to you says this deserves to be its own chapter. And so far, nobody has disagreed with us. So it is going to be its own chapter. In older ordinances, it's not. But the reason is it sometimes gets lost in the shuffle because it historically was not part of subdivision. So you got kind of bad street, you got technical cookie cutter street patterns. And it wasn't addressed at lot because now it's too late. The streets have been laid out. So increasingly, there's two parts to this, as I explained earlier. And these are the kinds of things that are addressed: transit connections, public transportation routes, pedestrian accessibility to and from those routes, meaning how does the public get to and from them? Transit facilities, drop off and curbside delivery areas related to that. Pedestrian and bicycle circulation unrelated to transit also. So where do you have to do a width? Where are you going to do bike paths? Where are you going to do connector paths? Connector paths sometimes take the form of, if your building is longer than X, you need to come, if your site is longer than X or your property is longer than X, you need to come up with a through block connection so that pedestrians can get through without having to walk around a long block, particularly a super block, particularly something bigger than a city block. Although cities that have urban areas like your downtown sometimes apply it to existing areas and say, when you redevelop this big site, we would like, and it's longer than 500-foot long block, we'd like to have a pedestrian path through so they don't have to walk as far as cars would have to drive to get to the next street in connection. So ingress and egress is really addressed usually at the site level. Where do you locate your driveways? Do you need to have, particularly for non-residential uses, and vision triangles? Do you or do you not want to protect vision triangles? That is the area that is between usually not a driveway, but two streets that are intersecting. This is one of those things you just end up talking about a lot. The bottom driveway, the bottom drawing shows vision triangles around a driveway. The top ones show them at a street corner. Most codes do include it at street corners, do not include them around driveways, and do not require them at all in some downtown areas, because the truth is everything was built right up to the property line. And at this point, trying to protect what we would protect in a more suburban context, the ability to see around a corner, would ruin the fabric. So we're not going to do it. But all of these things are topics to be addressed in kind of how much connectivity do we want to have? So at the subdivision level, again, parsing what I said earlier. Obviously, you all know this. Many aspects of your public streets are controlled by Ada County Highway Department or Idaho Transportation. There is, in your current code, there's acknowledgement of that. There's acknowledgement of the shared responsibility and the lack of control that you have in some areas because of these other jurisdictions. There is a general statement already, but it's just a general statement that when you do new streets, they should be designed for multimodal use. Newer codes usually include much more detailed descriptions of what does that mean? What types of streets need to have bikes? What types of streets need to be for pedestrians? When we worked in Albuquerque a few years ago, they kind of reluctantly came to the conclusion they had some streets that were just about moving traffic from one part of Albuquerque to the other. And it had to work that way, and they couldn't widen it, and they weren't going to narrow it. And so they actually had to say, in spite of our multimodal philosophy, there are places where this does not apply. Sidewalks are already required on both sides of your streets as a part of the platting process. At the site plan level, you do have some general statements about safe ingress and egress and service driveways in terms of how they're located. I have to say, in general, this is an important topic. We are already organizing your content into a new chapter that will address both the subdivision and the site plan level. But frankly, the standards are pretty general and not the strongest in terms of this, if it is a priority for Boise. Blueprint Boise talks a lot about it. We've heard a lot about it. Most places want to up their game. There's a lot to be done if that's going to be done in Boise. And the question is, if you want to do it, how to do it. So I want to talk about some just general thoughts about how some cities do this, and then throw it out for discussion. So again, there are two alternative approaches often included in modern zoning ordinances, primarily at the subdivision level, which is why we're raising it today. So the top drawing is a conceptual drawing out of a series of drawings that basically says when you are laying out particularly raw land, land on which you have not subdivided before, you need to have a certain amount of connectivity. For example, and I'm just making this up, for every quarter mile or every quarter mile or half mile of frontage distance, you need to have at least one north-south collector running through and one east-west collector coming through. This is not a requirement for a grid. It's a requirement that you allow different ways of getting through your property. You can make it curved, you can make it straight, you could make it whatever, but you've got to have a way for a medium-sized road to get through your property. And then sometimes it goes on, another drawing says for every quarter mile of frontage, you need to have at least some sort of a major local or a low-level collector going through there. That's what the lines mean. The text says, when you look at a piece of land of this size, and you bring in a plat, we're going to hold it up against this drawing and say, do you have an arterial on the section lines? Do you have a collector, at least one every so often? Do you have a local street network that connects among the collectors? And they're general. They allow the land subdivider a lot of freedom in how they do it, but they also, if you show up and say, well, I kind of had in mind something that is highly exclusive, and I don't really want people going through here, the city says that's not enough connectivity. The lower image is a connectivity index. And that is been used in modern codes, some of them, not, I would say a minority of them. Sometimes it's applied to large parcels of land that says, okay, you bring us a plat, we're going to do this kind of analysis. We are going to count up how many street segments you have, and those are yellow dots, segments between intersections. Then we are going to count up the blue dots of intersections, places where you can connect to a different path to a different place. And the blue dots of your connections to the outside world. We're going to count them up. We're going to do some math, and we're going to say you got to have at least a ratio of 1.71. There's no magic to that number. I've seen it played around some say 2, some say 1.65. It's an artificial number. But it is done often by a city going into its existing neighborhoods with a level of connectivity that they like and say, you don't have to do a grid. We realize the world is not all a grid street, that a lot of places stopped doing that after the war. But we like the level of connectivity that happens through that. So we're going to measure it, and it turned out it was 1.71, it turned out it was 1.5, it turned out it was 2.0. And when you come back in, we're going to say, talk with your site planner, design to your market, but we're going to see that level. We want to see that level of connectivity. If you show up and you don't hit this number, we're going to say you need to add some intersections. You need to add some points of connectivity internally or externally, because that's how we want to regulate it. Now, I've had a number of clients put this in and then take it out after they've modeled it and said, done, we think this is only going to work on sites of 15 acres or larger, 20 acres or larger, big parcels. And so they limit it that way. Others have said, sounds cool, looks sexy. We went back and studied our subdivisions and said, it is hard to apply this. So we're going to take it out and go with something more like the upper drawing. Another way of doing it in urban areas, urban context, is to say, we don't want to see blocks longer than X or perimeters. It is often, we don't want to see blocks longer than 600 feet, or we don't want to see perimeters of a block more than 1,600 feet, something like that. New urbanists like this idea because it says, you go ahead. I'm not saying it's a grid. I'm saying without higher math in the lower drawing or conceptual connections in the upper drawing, we're going to measure the outer perimeter of your lots. And when they're too big, we're going to say, you need to break that up. You need to have a smaller lot. And again, I mentioned earlier, some newer ordinances say, if you got a big parcel, we want to see you don't have to build another street, but we want another way for pedestrians and bicycles to get through because it takes them longer to get places. So Blueprint Boise talks about a lot of this. Street network, vehicle, bicycle, pedestrian paths, all travel modes and the design of streets. You really talked about this a lot. Encourage walking in a variety of strips, adding sidewalk connections, restoring damaged sidewalks. Well-lit, secure, and convenient. and then minimizing pedestrian conflict with vehicles by providing buffers between the sidewalk and automobile traffic. So that's what Blueprint Boise says. And here's the question. So as I kind of hinted earlier, many new ordinances establish more detailed standards, either maximum block dimensions or streets cost money. So you could talk about any of these: maximum block dimensions, connectivity index, through connectivity drawings. But again, there's a trade-off here, guys. The more streets you have, the more it costs money. Those street costs and utility costs under the streets have to be divided over the lots. And more streets often means fewer lots. Some newer codes say, we like the streets, we like the connectivity, and we'll give you more lots. We don't care. We'll have more intensity for the sake of more connectivity. So the question is, what do you want to tell us about balancing? We've talked connectivity. Your Blueprint Boise's all over the topic, and then you have, and then you've got this this discussion about affordability and affordable housing, and streets cost money. So you've got a tension here. What do you want to tell us about how to resolve that?
Okay, we have Daniel, followed by Chris.
Yeah, so I thought the materials that were included in our packet for this meeting address this. We're helpful on helping think through this issue. And one of the things they talked about is just, if you can have smaller streets, then that may be part of how you compromise, which is you devote less of acreage to cars and that. So I'm wondering how, if that has been part of the solution set, because I think certainly it's highlighted in Blueprint Boise, and there's a lot of reasons to think this connectivity and access for walking and biking is something we really do want to build into our communities. And narrower streets may help with that. So how have other jurisdictions used narrower, smaller streets to hit this balance?
The short answer is yes, but the longer and more difficult answer is this has a lot to do with ACHD. And
they'll be very easy to work with on this.
I've heard there, no offense to everybody.
You don't need to worry about that at all, Don.
Yeah, I got it. That's why I'm not happy with my answer to you. Portland, Oregon is usually cited as an innovator in this area. They had fights between people who wanted wider streets, and wider streets for fire engines or other things, and citizens who wanted narrow streets for affordability and walkability. I am told that in layman's terms, the mayor locked him in a room and said, "Come out when you agree." We are going to reach a compromise, and we are going to stick with that compromise. And they did. They came up with the Skinny Streets Handbook, and were able to make good progress on that. But that's what it takes. It takes somebody forcing it to happen. And my understanding is that's difficult in Boise because of the relationship there.
So just to add a little bit to that, so yes, ACHD does own and control our roadways. But there's another facet as well as, so our emergency services have also provided significant comment in regard to that. So ACHD has actually just recently allowed us to use some narrower street sections and narrower right-of-ways for the public streets. The city creates their own standards and design criteria for private streets. So we'll be focusing mostly on those private streets, but we can also focus on other ways of connectivity. So using pathways along our irrigation canals, using internal pathways that allow bicyclists and pedestrians to get from one block to another as well. So there's some alternatives that we can think of as we move forward. So Chris, followed by Patrick, and then Drew.
So this transitions well, because part of my question was what control we do have, knowing that HCHD has control over the roads. And so I guess if there's any additional things to add to that, that would be helpful, of what things we can actually put into the code that can address things like roads. And but my question that sort of expands on this is specifically related to transit connections. So what control or what things can we put into the zoning code regarding transit? So especially knowing that our transit currently isn't all that comprehensive, but that there are a lot of plans to change that dramatically in the next 20 years. What are things that we can actually include in the code that will address things like public transit, things like the future for if light rail comes in? What things can we actually put in that addresses that in the zoning code?
So we're not here to talk about module 1, but we did address some of that in module 1 because the zone districts that are activity centers, the big activity centers and the medium activity centers, at the last section of those has a form control subset, not on the smallest ones, but on the medium, actually all 3 of them. But it's designed to say, if you are in these activity centers, which are generally located to reinforce your emerging transit system, you need to provide good connectivity to and from the surrounding areas into the section. And that means not just for bikes and peds, but frankly, bikes and peds, and to prevent them from interfering with cars. You need cars because some people are going to drive and ride and some people are not. And you'd like those to not run into each other all the time. We tried to address it in the activity centers in module 1.
Okay.
Patrick, go ahead.
Very quickly, I agree with the general sentiment that expressed both in the chat and in some of the comments. To the extent that we're able to narrow streets or paths or what have you, less roadway, but still maintain the connectivity is a nice way to meet a compromise. Thanks.
Let me ask one question. I don't want to cut Drew off, but it relates to the last 3 comments. Andrea, did I overstate the fact, the comments about private streets? Is Boise more willing to consider private streets because that is a way of getting even narrower streets or more connectivity than you've been able to negotiate with ACHD, and the city is willing to absorb the future maintenance of those streets? I don't want to overstate what was a national true statement, but may not be true given Boise's situation.
Well, the city of Boise would prefer to have all of our roadways to be public. It's a way to provide consistency for maintenance and those types of things. When we talk about affordability, when you build a private street, sometimes you have lesser standards, sometimes you have lesser widths. However, that affordability is then passed on to those homeowners over time. So oftentimes what we'll see is a street with a cul-de-sac at the end, and we only have 7 property owners. Well, when you divide the maintenance up over 7 homes, they are unable to afford to repair that. And ACHD will not take that road on like some other jurisdictions do nationwide. So ultimately, then we end up with a neighborhood or a street or a cul-de-sac that is now in disrepair. It will not be fixed. It will not be repaired. Now they have lesser access to emergency services to get there quickly. They might not have the surfacing that's necessary. And then it ultimately becomes disinvested. And so is that equitable? Is that fair? So we always say that the public street is the best way to go. It can also ensure that we are getting the connectivity that we're talking about today. But, there are always instances where you can't always work in a public street, or there are instances where ACHD has simply said, we don't want to maintain a cul-de-sac because it's expensive and it only serves those individuals. It doesn't provide connectivity to anyone else. And so they want to put that onus on that smaller neighborhood. So that's a delicate balance that we have to think about as well as we're moving forward. And then we always want to make sure that we have wide enough streets to accommodate for emergency services, making sure that we have appropriate turnarounds and those types of things.
Sorry to interrupt, Drew. I think you're next.
I'll just echo kind of what Patrick said, support for being creative with some of the lack of tools that we may have compared to other places. And if that means pathways, narrower streets, et cetera, I think when I asked about subdivisions earlier, I think that's maybe one of the more critical areas. If you were to pull up that graphic you had up earlier, that agricultural land to the north probably will be developed at some time, maybe. And if this isn't required in some way, shape, or form, 5 or 6 or 7-year-old that wants to bike over their friend's house and that adjacent subdivision would be forced to go onto a busy county road. And that's a critical piece of having character and having livable neighborhoods. So some level of requirement, yes, but I think with being kind of pragmatic in the area we are with a few tools missing, like I said.
Can I ask one? I know that Andrea, you'll want to get to some public comments, but let me ask this. So Blueprint Boise is all over this issue, and I get the comments that the comments have been largely about the trade-off between cost and other things, cost and connectivity. I put out 3 paradigms. A generalized requirement: don't bring us a plat that doesn't have a through connectivity of the following type at least every so many feet, a connectivity index, which is math, and a block perimeter block size issue. Those of you who have developed or participated in development of property, do you have any thoughts on which one you would like to see? Blueprint Boise makes clear, and the current regulations make clear, you need something more if you want to get to where you're going to go. So what kind of more? Does anybody have anything to offer in terms of, well, I'd sure hate to see Boise adopt X, or I would love to see Boise adopt Y? So, Byron?
The only comment I have after going through this process a number of times is frequently the lots and the parcels that we're dealing with are surrounded by existing development that either rejected connectivity or for whatever reason are completely cut off. And it's really difficult to know how to connect, say, an internal parcel to the parcels that surround it. But every once in a while there is connectivity there, and there are some, there's a path, to clear, as long as the requirements address historic connectivity for previously developed parcels, and having that be higher on the hierarchy of development requirements. I would say that almost all of these, I don't know, I have a hard time kind of landing on which requirement really is best, because of course it depends.
Okay.
But I would say that that's a fairly high, a fairly high level of importance for the developments I've been a part of.
And in the chat, Richard has shared that he's not a fan of the connectivity index.
That's the power of a sexy drawing. People have adopted it, but I think I was very clear. Some places love it, and a lot of places have found it difficult to work with. Well, what I hear what I'm gathering is connectivity with historically platted and established routes is important, and flexibility is important. It is, if you look around any city, even, there are parts which are streets and alleys and it's very predictable, but any interesting city has places where it's not streets and alleys, it's something else. And as long as it connects through, people can live with it. And in fact, you get what you're looking for, even though you couldn't have predicted the exact connections in advance. So. Anybody else on this before, Andrew, do you want to, we go to other public comment?
Yeah, if anybody has any additional comments, this would be the appropriate time for those. Otherwise, we can, oh, Richard's got something, and then we can, if anybody else has anything, and then we'll move on to our attendees for today. Richard.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of a different, or has been a different philosophy between ACHD and maybe some people in urban planning, and maybe it's helpful to think of that. I believe ACHD and some people believe that most of the traffic flow, and by traffic flow here, I'm talking about cars, should be on arterials, and versus having kind of connectivity or kind of flow through neighborhoods. I'm not sure how much that applies here, but if it does apply, that might be a useful kind of conversation or to think about. So just throwing that out there.
Thanks. No, I think you're right, Richard. From my distant view of the relationship and the priorities, I think that's an accurate stuff.
Okay, if there isn't anything else, we do have 2 individuals that are with us today. So we have Ed McCluskey and Joshua Clements. And, I will go ahead and, ask them, do they have anything that they would like to share with us today? Ed does. So let's go ahead and Ed, you are free to speak.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Hey, this is my first time being able to speak with you people, and I appreciate being able to do that. I came in a bit late, would just say on the connectivity thing that I agree with Richard in terms of trying to respect existing neighborhoods. I'm not a fan of any more designs, particularly in a very dense area where I live near the city, to have other roads blowing through or getting rid of the occasional dead end streets, which are small by, 4 to 6 houses, being considered as another pathway for connectivity. There's already a great deal of assault on that in many parts of the inner core of the city. So I think that's an interest that I have. And I think the Southeast Neighborhood Association has as well. Connectivity matters when there's more room. But when we have this sort of grow with concentration where it's already concentrated, then we get an imbalance with some of these formulae. That's all I really wanted to say. And thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ed. And then Josh, if you would like to share with us, you're welcome to. You're also welcome to pass if you should choose.
Nope. Thank you for this discussion. I'm an urban planner from elsewhere in the country, and I'm pursuing some opportunities in the region. And so I saw this meeting was scheduled, and as a planning nerd, I thought I would attend and learn something today. So thank you very much.
Perfect. So those are our 2 attendees for today that were able to join us. So anybody else have any thoughts that they'd like to share with the group before we call it a day?
I would just add one thought. It's been, fun for me to listen to the conversations that go on amongst you in between these meetings, and sometimes the articles that you refer each other to. And I look at those articles too. I try to read them, and so I would just encourage people to keep doing that. And if you have something pro or con, or just a different angle on the things that we're going to talk about next time, which include landscaping and lighting and parking, and design, just general design issues. Go ahead and if you feel comfortable, share them, because I think that's helpful. There has been, frankly, a good level of communication amongst all of you in between the meetings, better than in some cities I've been. So I'm pleased to see that. I just urge you to keep sharing and share with the whole group if you'd like. Even if they don't respond, they may click on the link and look at the article. So.
Yeah, and I would just like to remind everybody that if we are sharing materials, make sure that it comes from a credible or worthy source, oftentimes scientific, or planning related. Those types of things are certainly best. So just make sure that you're reviewing the source and that it's a quality source.
Hey, for once we finished 5 minutes early. How about that?
Look at that. Great job, guys. We had a great conversation today, and many of you participated. We will be sending out the survey as we normally do. So that's going to give you an opportunity to provide any input that you may think of later, or as you share with others. So go ahead and get that to us so that we can start to use that material to inform us as we draft Module 2. And with that, I would say meeting adjourned.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.